Hi everyone, welcome back to the Nook. I just cut my hair and I feel a lot lighter. It's a much welcome change, especially when the weather is getting really hot here in Singapore. This video has been something I've been wanting to do for the longest time. In case you didn't know, I am Singaporean. I live in Singapore. And I've studied in Singapore my whole life. I think somewhere along the line of this whole channel, I have not been making as much content about Singapore books. And I thought that was really unfortunate because I finally am able to sort of bring Singaporean books to the forefront and in front of a more general audience. This week, what we'll be attempting is a week-long reading challenge of a stack of Singapore related books. And I say that because I don't want to say like Singlit, because Singlit is the kind of unofficial term of what we call Singapore literature. But I don't want to read just fiction because on this channel I tend to read a lot of non-fiction and a lot of different kinds of books. So next to me I do have an entire stack of books which I will attempt to read as much of in a week's time, which is kind of crazy. I don't think I can do it, but anyway. We'll see how much I can cover and we'll see what I think about these books. I'm really excited, actually. I'm just so excited to share these books with you all. And if any of my videos were to go viral, I hope it's this one, because look at the amount of books that we can read about Singapore. I know that a lot of people like to watch those, like I read this people's books, like I read these people's recommendations for week videos. I hope you can watch this too. So yeah, let's go. Hi, it's the second day and I am gonna give an update on the first two books I read. Lion City, Singapore and the Invention of Modern Asia by Jeevan Vasagar, as well as The Mouse Marathon by Ovidia Yu. So this is a non-fiction title, and I would say generally it's a pretty good read. I was pleasantly surprised by the details that the author decided to include in this book. A lot of authors tend to romanticize Singapore, so even though there was some critique throughout the book, towards the end the author still ended off on a pretty optimistic tone and a pretty trusting voice in the country's future. So the author still kind of discuss certain controversial things, things like the kind of anti-communist sentiments that were happening in the post-independent era in Singapore, as well as different kinds of activists and even things like legal activities in Singapore, sort of the ethical or moral considerations when it came to bringing casinos back to Singapore. If you are looking for a general non-fiction about Singapore, I would recommend this book. I think for someone who wants a bit more of an overall objective view of Singapore's history, not one that is overly romanticized. It still does a pretty good job in talking about the contentious points in Singapore's history and as a modern city. And I would recommend it even for Singaporeans who want a refresher of their own country's history, especially a lot of people who might not know some of the very historical moments in Singapore's past. This book does cover some of it. You're not gonna get any sort of ultra controversial things, neither are you gonna get something that paints Singapore in a perfectly good way. So I think it's a pretty good moderate balance if you're looking for that kind of book. The next book I read was The Mouse Marathon by Ovidia Yu. This is a collection of short chapters. I realized that in the end, all these characters that the author introduces, they are all related to one another in the end, in conclusion. It is still a very narrow slice of how life is like in Singapore. This follows primarily this one kind of advertising executive by the name of Lee J. Lin, and this person is someone who just is kind of from a higher, a middle class to upper middle class background, but it is a pretty fun read. I think it was entertaining and it was confusing at some points, but I just took it as a leisurely read for 2 hours, and if I see it that way, I enjoyed it. There isn't a lot of very deep takes on anything, although I kind of felt like some of the characters' actions were very out of place. There was some actions and some developments that didn't really make sense. But then again, I'm quite forgiving when it comes to fiction. I'm not very strict on plot development because I just kind of enjoy being with the characters and being in the setting. So not a bad book. I would recommend it for people who are like, you know, professional executives in Singapore. You might kind of relate to this kind of rat race inquiry, and also kind of very messy relationships between families and past relationships and exes and all that. You might relate to this book if you're in that kind of world. Anyway, those are the two books that I've read for yesterday, and today we're gonna move on to something a bit more exciting. This is gonna be a little bit more political, I guess, in terms of Singapore. The first one is the Last Great Strike, The Untold Story of the Strike That Closed the Straits Times by Clement Mesenas, and the next one is Chua Huat's Liberalism, Disavowed. I'm not gonna make myself read the entire thing. As you can tell, I actually read the first few chapters already, so I'm just gonna be finishing the rest here. As for this, I am starting on it new today. Pretty interesting to see what kind of insights come out of all these books, so stay tuned. Yeah. This video is gonna end up like being 40 minutes long or like 50 minutes long, but just enjoy it because I am enjoying this video so much, so I hope you enjoy it too. Welcome back to day 3. I didn't film on day 2 because things were quite messy at home. I mean, literally messy. So I didn't feel the best in filming, but I did finish the 2 books I set out to finish. The first book I want to talk about is Liberalism, Disavowed by Chua Huat. So this is a book that I think will be a pretty good follow-up to the book that I just finished 2 days ago, The Lion City. So if you're interested in the kind of very, very, very detailed political development of Singapore, this book might be interesting, but this is not the only book that talks about Singapore's like political development. There are a lot of books, and this one has a lot on the economic development of Singapore and how that ties into state policy. But I would say it is a very kind of a distant analysis approach, which I would say only would be intriguing or even engaging enough for people who are willing to sit through, you know, hours of lectures. I mean, this book is kind of like for people like that. I would include this in the list of books that you might want to read for people who are a lot more interested in understanding Singapore much more deeply on a kind of academic level. But other than that, this is not really for general reading. For general reading, I would recommend Lion City a lot more. That is more for general audiences, and for people who want to push themselves in terms of political and economic development in Singapore, you might want to consider this book instead. In contrast, if you're looking for something that's a bit more approachable but about political issues in Singapore, you might want to check out some of the works by Cherian. This is Air Conditioned Nation Revisited, essays on Singapore politics, and Cherian is a pretty well-known academic that talks about Singapore, and he basically publishes from outside Singapore because a lot of his works are kind of disapproved in Singapore in some way by the authorities, and I felt that this bunch of essays were a lot easier to access, and talks a lot about Singapore politics in a very, very straightforward way. But of course, some of the essays are quite repetitive because these were kind of selected and compiled, so there are some overlapping topics, but I would recommend this a bit more for those who are just interested in the politics and not so much on the nitty-gritty economic details of Singapore. Let's move on to the next book, which is a lot less academic and a lot less strenuous, and that is The Last Great Strike, The Untold Story of the Strike That Closed the Straits Times by Mesenas. And you know, this book was published in 2013, and it's about a strike that happened in 1971. And let me just tell you, the tone of this book really felt like it was written in 1971 and not 2013. There is a lot of the tone is very, very casual, and I felt a bit uncomfortable with the way that the women in the story were kind of prominently. The women were mainly featured through their appearances alone. So if there was a woman that came into the picture, she was probably kind of mentioned because of her looks, because of her disposition, and not necessarily because of anything that she did in the strike. And that kind of made me realize, like, oh, okay, there are people who still think that way and are living today and are in positions of power. But anyway, so yes, it is pretty much men-dominated space. That this entire strike kind of happened mostly kind of initiated by a bunch of young men who were starting out in their journalism careers. And what really struck me about this was kind of how it all came together. So actually the first 2/3 of the book weren't really about the strike. It's only the last third of the book that really talked about how the strike happened, and the first 2/3 were kind of just a montage of things that were happening at the Straits Times and the management and general happenings of Singapore in that time. For me, the interesting part was really how the strike came together, how union leaders and different parts of the management, how they came together and discussed things, and in the end they held out a strike in order to ask for a 2.5-month bonus. At this time, the Straits Times was still functioning in 2 offices, one in KL, Kuala Lumpur, and one in Singapore. It was interesting to see how after the strike, they kind of have to go their separate ways. With some further research, I realized that strikes aren't illegal in Singapore today, but they are extremely difficult to pull off because you need a consensus of a majority in order to pull off a strike. And you have to do that secretly, like you can't ask, you can't solicit it publicly. And another thing is that if you're an essential worker, you can't actually call for a strike, which is kind of doesn't really make sense, because most people who need a strike are people who are working in essential jobs. So that kind of puzzled me a bit, but that's the state of affairs here in Singapore. And these are some pictures that are in the book, kind of showing the strike as it happened, and I thought it was so interesting that you could actually see these things happening in Singapore during that time. It's really rare. Yeah, I mean, and I think a constant theme across the books I've read so far about Singapore have been talking a lot about the kind of civic freedoms in Singapore. And there's a major theme every time you want to read about Singapore in any sort of non-fiction book. There's always going to be a segment about liberties in the sense of like civic freedoms, freedom of speech, maybe expression of your sexuality and things like that, which would be more prominently featured in my other books. But that was the most intriguing part, the fact that young people back then could come together and have this solidarity in such an overt way, and that actually convinced the management to do something about their pay. Completely unheard of industrial action. What does that mean in Singapore? I just wonder how it would look like today in Singapore, and the fact that it isn't kind of illegal, but me talking about it could be a bit contentious in this channel, but we'll see about that. Anyway, the next book I finished was something pretty easy to read. This is SQ21, Singapore Queers in the 21st Century by Yi-Sheng. And oh my god, I really enjoyed this book. I only took about 2 hours to finish reading the entire thing, maybe even less, like an hour and a half, because these are basically stories of different people, so it was pretty easy to read. The tone was super casual. This was all compiled by this writer called Yi-Sheng, published during a time where it is still very uncommon today, but it was even more uncommon back then to very publicly talk about LGBTQ, like the identity, the community, the rights, the law, and things like that. And the fact that this was published was really crazy to me, that they actually, all these people came out pretty publicly, had their real faces and their real names in here, and all that. I mean, if you ask me to be in a compilation today, I might hesitate a little bit, but it is very heartening to read these stories and to see how diverse the experiences were. But of course, the author was really great in acknowledging that there were a lot of people that he couldn't represent in this book, and I'm super glad that even in 2006 there was so much of this kind of progressiveness in the way that they wanted to publish this collection of stories, and I really enjoyed how candid some of these stories were. I'm so glad I have it in my collection. I think this is a book that I would definitely be very proud of having and to share with people. Those were the books I finished in the past 2 days. And so technically now I'm supposed to move on to these 2 books, because continuing on the theme of queer Singapore, yeah, I mean, obviously, I did start on this book by Amanda Lee Koh, and so far I find it a bit difficult to get into, mostly because it's a novel. I have a very bad track record with novels, so it's just me and it's a historical fiction. So I think for more of a general audiences who enjoy literary fiction, this might be a better book for you to get into. So far, I like Amanda Lee Cole's writing. I've always enjoyed her writing, but in this case, I feel like the setting and the characters don't really speak to me, but that's fine because again, my standards for a good novel is really quite niche. On the other hand, we have this book, Mobilising Gay Singapore, Rights and Resistance in an Authoritarian State by Lynette Chua. And yeah, I mean, this is definitely something I'm a lot more comfortable with reading. So in this book, there is a primary focus on this thing called pragmatic resistance. And this is a strategy that seeks to advance the movement while ensuring that it survives the scrutiny and potential retaliation of authoritarian rulers. A strategy born out of creativity and resilience of human agency in the face of adversity. And I really, really, really enjoyed that paragraph. I think that kind of encapsulates activism as a whole in Singapore, but definitely kind of the LGBTQ rights activism the most, because it's one of the most visible activisms that you can see in Singapore. Is activism even a word? I mean, it's one of the most visible movements you can see in Singapore. A lot of activists in Singapore kind of espouse the same ideals of having to work long term with the law, and that political change in Singapore looks really different from how it might look in other countries. There is a need to preserve the status quo, but at the same time to introduce the marginal groups as ordinary, normal folk. So that is the main strand of narrative here, that you want to introduce marginalized people as like one of us, one of everyone else, instead of kind of highlighting the differences and highlighting the unique characteristics of each marginal group. From this point of the video onwards, there's going to be a huge drop in the video quality as well as the audio quality. Huge apologies for that. I'm so sorry for the inconsistency in this video, but I do hope you continue to watch nonetheless and enjoy the rest of the video. Thank you. I don't know whether this angle works. I am trying to make my videos a lot more interesting. Hi! Yes, so I have... Are you hungry? Is that why? And today it's kind of raining, so it is kind of dim. So please, I apologize for the very cloudy vibe. I decided to drop reading Delayed Rays of a Star because I just felt like as a novel it is a bit too long for me to really engage in a short period of time. I just felt like I couldn't really get into the setting, whereas this book obviously caught my interest and caught my attention for a way longer time, but that's just how I work because I'm very bad at reading fiction. Anyway, this is Mobilising Gay Singapore, Rights and Resistance in an Authoritarian State by Lynette Chua. Primary premise of this entire book is navigating how gay activists go around lawmaking in Singapore and in that way forward the movement in Singapore. This Singapore context one is pretty interesting because we are classified as like a authoritarian state, and there is a lot of navigation you have to do in terms of bureaucratic navigation and also just like the way you phrase things. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it is very, very interesting to note that the way that you do activism in Singapore, the way you have to code it and the way you have to kind of describe it, portray it to the media and portray it to the authorities, it all has to be really calculated, and in that way it kind of reinforces or reproduces the way that the Singapore society works, because all about the way that systems are enacted and maintained in Singapore is by calculation and engineering, and that engineering is replicated in queer activism as well. Of course, the law itself has great literal meaning for the community, but I do think that things happen a lot more symbolically here, and that's really interesting. So I think this is kind of like a quintessential read if you want to read about queer activism in Singapore. Definitely like a module, like if you had to take classes on like queer activism, this would be a module on its own, like law and resistance in queer Singapore, something like that, Welcome back to the last day of the Singapore book challenge that I'm doing, and I have finished these 3 books over here. I guess I'll just go through them. The first one is The Keepers of Stories by Suffian Hakim. I really enjoy Suffian Hakim's writing. I find it really enjoyable and also profound in a simple way. Very everyday stories, but also writing characters in a way that make them seem larger than life. He would fall within the realm of YA. His stories, I think it's kind of in the category of YA, but I still think that his writing is enjoyable by all ages. This plot generally is about 2 children who have been brought to a community near Changi Beach in Singapore, and this community of people, they live in this sort of isolated place from society, and they call themselves the Anak Bumi, which is children of the earth. And every night they have this ritual called the Wayang Singa, where they tell stories to everyone else. There is an overarching plot that surrounds the community, but generally there are little inserts of the stories by different characters as kind of signaled by the Wayang Singa ritual. And I really enjoy this form of storytelling. I think it really reminds me of the whole 1001 Nights kind of storytelling, rather than following this very linear, progressive, classical, contemporary literature trope where you just follow one character and you are just kind of very subsumed by the details rather than the whole general broadness of the world. So I really enjoyed this story. I find it a lot more heartwarming than the Minorities, which I really enjoyed. The Minorities was a bit more humorous, but this one was a bit more of a bedtime story vibe. And I love how there isn't a clear happy ending for everyone involved. I do think there is quite a lot of underlying messages and stories that you can glean from this book, even though it is kind of written for a younger type of audience, I feel. The next book I finished is Lost Nostalgia, stories by Muhammad Latif Muhammad, and it's translated by Nasri Barawi. So it is originally published in Malay, and I think that the translator, Nasri Barawi, actually does a lot of translating work, and also kind of wanting to push more of Bahasa works into the English-speaking world. I really appreciate that, and I think there is an afterword where the translator did talk a little bit more about how works from the Bahasa world tend to be very easily grouped into magical realism, or even a lot of traditional Asian styles of storytelling tend to be compacted into what is called magical realism in the sort of Western Eurocentric world of publishing. The collection of short stories here are definitely very influenced by traditional forms of storytelling, where you might go very religious with some of the references, but some of it is quite allegorical. Some of the stories here are almost spiritual in its essence, but others are just kind of snippets of everyday life, and I like that. I really liked how there are different essays and different stories that have different ranges. It's not just a very specific type of character. There are different kind of characters and different kind of religious identities. They're all basically around Islam identity, but the different characters also treat their own beliefs and spirituality a bit differently. And generally, I find that this book in itself, if it might feel a bit disjunct if you're just reading it in isolation. I feel like if you're thinking of having a whole collection of very coherent short stories, this is definitely not it, because some of the short stories seem very incomplete, but I don't mind that. To me, fiction is very broad and flexible, and I don't think that it's a flaw when characters are underdeveloped or when plots seem to just jump over, because to me that's how I feel about my own world anyways. I don't really expect fictional works to present a perfect kind of textbook perfect way of explaining things, which is what I really enjoyed about a previous novel called The Man with the Compound Eyes. This is probably going to be interesting to readers who want to know more about Singaporean authors who have been writing during Singapore's like independence era and sort of the very rapid developments that you see in urbanizing Singapore. So this will definitely be very interesting for those people who are really interested in that kind of literature. Nowadays, I find myself gravitating towards more Bahasa works lately rather than just generally Singaporean works, and I enjoy them a lot more. So I am wondering whether I should try and seek out I don't know, like more other like non-Bahasa works to see whether I should test that hypothesis. The last book that I finished is Tao's The Sixth Sense. Again, this is just an art book, so it's not really anything substantial, a lot of just flipping through artworks, and I don't really know whether this counts as a book, but I do want to introduce more art books in my future videos because I do think that art appreciation is something that should also be made available to everyone. Okay, so my battery just died really dramatically on me, so I'll just finish off what I was saying. This book, it's an art book, and I kind of feel like it's not so much really about the artist that I learned more about, although it is very fascinating. Her work deals a lot with trying to replicate organic shapes and matter through her own hands, so kind of making paper by scratch, or kind of trying to replicate organic shapes through the manipulation of raw materials and things like that. So you can see here she did some chemical experiments with some, I think this is brass, I'm not too sure, but it is pretty interesting to see what kind of reactions she gets. And this kind of art as experimentation rather than art as expression, which I thought was really interesting as well. I find this like so important to be able to make things from scratch or to create things from scratch, but a lot of us are isolated from that ability to make things from scratch. And I've been thinking about this a lot, like what does it mean to literally craft your existence? But that's getting a bit too philosophical. In this case, in the context of Singapore, I think this artist, the way that she does her work is really interesting if you think about it in contrast to Singapore's urban landscape, where everything is so man-made and artificial, that you would kind of question like, why would you spend 48 hours preparing a sheet of paper? But I do think that that act in itself is a kind of non-conformist act, and it's about kind of really taking from the ground and trying to make something out of it. So yeah, that's the end of the Singapore Book Challenge. Whoa! I think I managed to finish quite a lot of books, surprisingly. I wasn't expecting myself to really go through everything, and I actually did read a couple of other books, like not a couple, I did read like 2 other books in the process of this that were not Singaporean, just to kind of give myself a bit of a breathing room between each Singaporean book. But this challenge has been really, really interesting and fun. I really wanted to emphasize that, like, yes, I am someone that has grown up in Singapore and I base my content here, and I just really wanted to take the opportunity to share a lot of these books with you all, because I know that a lot of you are not from Singapore or not from the region, and I hope this video has kind of shared a little bit more about the country and more about the different strands of thought that I have regarding this place. And if any of the books interest you, please go ahead and check them out. Ethos Books is having a sale until the end of the month, if I'm not wrong. This video is not sponsored by them, don't worry, but I have been such a huge fan of their works, and they've always been producing really progressive and relevant titles by a lot of important perspectives in Singapore. So if you can support them by purchasing some of their works, go ahead. Yeah, so that's it from me, and I guess I want to extend this challenge to any of you that might want to try it. If you're from Singapore, you can do a week-long challenge as well, with regards to any Singaporean book that you want to read and complete in that week. If not, you can come up with your own list of books from your own country. I would love to see what books you would want to read as a local in your own place, and what books you want to share the whole book to your community. This was really, really enriching for me as an experience, and I'm so glad that I was able to share it with you all. So thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for watching this self-indulgent video. Do let me know if you would like to see more of these kind of week-long challenges. I know they are pretty popular, I guess, so we'll see. But thanks, bye.